And record. So you should all have that popping up, letting you know that this meeting is being recorded. And we're going to talk about assessment, and we're going to talk about how we can sort of start conceptualizing assessment at the start of the school year. And I just want to sort of give the disclaimer that I have y'all in front of me, but I have a screen here and a screen here. So if you see me looking away, I'm not looking away from you. I am just looking at the other screens that I have as I present. My name's Allison Caldwell. I know most of you in here because we are part of the Structured Literacy Initiative with the state of New Mexico, but we have decided this year in an effort to try to build the capacity of us as coaches and to reach the teachers and administrators across the state that we would open these professional development sessions up to teachers, administrators, coaches in school buildings across the state. So if you are joining us from one of those schools, thank you very much for joining us. I work as a structured literacy coach here with the state, with this RECs. And this is my second year in this role. I get to work with 2 schools in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Prior to that, I've worked for Rio Rancho Public Schools and for Albuquerque Public Schools. I want to ask you, please, this should be conversational and interactive. It's no fun for me to just sit here and sort of like chirp at all of you. So if you have questions, please feel free to unmute and ask those questions. I don't consider it an interruption. You can also use the chat to ask questions. And then I also am going to ask, if possible, I know some people are in different spaces, but if possible, it's wonderful to have cameras on, because that just allows us to be collaborating and connecting as professionals. And even though we're in a virtual setting, I like to read the room, so to speak. And so if I'm talking and I see a lot of like, sort of faces, it tells me that maybe what I'm trying to share isn't landing and I need to try to explain or see what questions might exist. And so I will ask you if possible, if you could have those cameras off, that would be great. We will be uploading this recording so that you will have access to it if you feel like it's something you want to share or look at again later. I want to talk a little bit about our goals for today. I said we were going to talk about assessments, and this is not an iStation training. iStation is used throughout New Mexico, but that's not really the purpose of this time together today. There are resources for iStation training if that is something that you're interested in. It's more about how we think about assessment and how we apply that within our school buildings. So we're going to talk about how the brain learns to read. We'll review some of those anchors, as those are important anchors to help us when we are moving this work forward and talking about assessment, data, instruction, and how we pull all of those things together. And then we're going to consider the different types of assessments, the roles they serve, and how those assessments can help us fill the skill gaps of our learners. So this first one is the simple view of reading. And just a quick thumbs up or thumbs down. I would imagine most of you have seen this before. Has anybody not seen this before? And if not, that's totally okay, because we're all sort of walking through this journey of getting more knowledge together. Anybody not seen this? Thumbs down if you haven't, thumbs up if you have. Cool. Okay. So then let's talk about it together, because I think part of the importance of knowing these anchors is knowing them deep enough that we can talk about them with our colleagues. We can talk about them in PLCs. We could even talk about them with parents when helping parents understand if their students are behind, why that might be. So this anchor, the simple view of reading, I think it was 1986 when Goff and Tunmer first presented it. So my question for you all is, why is this a multiplication problem, right? Like, we know that reading is not simple, but why a multiplication problem?
Because it's interchangeable.
So tell me more what you mean by that, Robin, interchangeable.
You can, it's almost like commutative property. You can move the different factors, and it's almost like a fact family, I guess.
Yes, yes. And I think you're saying the same as what Ada put in the chat, right? Like you can't have one without the other. There is an interdependence on these two factors that get us to this factor here, right? To get us to that product. So I think what you're describing, Robin, and feel free to correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but if I have this, I think we've probably all seen this. Anything times 0 is 0. And then the opposite of that is also true, right? So if I have word recognition, but I don't have language comprehension, I'm still not getting to that outcome of reading comprehension. And the opposite of that would also be true. Yes, Kendra, anything times 0 is 0. You must have both or you won't get the correct outcome. The thing that I sort of want to extend on this a little bit that I think is not something I had previously seen presented commonly is just how important it is that students have a high level of accuracy in each of these spaces. So if we're thinking about the multiplicative relationship here, my background is mostly in special education. And in special education, we seem to write all of our IEP goals with 80% accuracy, which is fine for some things. But if I'm at 80% accuracy in the skills associated with word recognition and 80% accuracy at the skills associated with language comprehension, how much of my text am I truly comprehending?
Only about 40%.
About 60%, like
60%.
0.64, right? So if our goal or our objective for our students is that they are able to use reading to learn and engage with the world around them, 64% accuracy of reading comprehension is not enough. So when it comes to word reading and language comprehension, we have to have a high level of accuracy if the purpose for teaching those skills is moving students towards reading comprehension. How do we feel about that? Aha moment. Yep, that was a huge for me.
I
Not
think
good.
that is really huge, and seeing it the way that you've broken it down is, I mean, because you think, oh, 80% accuracy, that's good. You know, we're there, it's above average, it's good. But then when it's written out as a multiplication problem, a 64% is not okay.
Not okay. And like,
Wow.
it's thinking about, like when we say 80% accuracy, when we're talking about writing IEP goals, it is like, it's thinking about that like A through F grading system, right? But that's not what this is. This is not an A through F grading system. This is building skills to move us forward in mastering the skill of reading and reading comprehension so that we can use that for reading and learning. Go ahead, Pat.
Well, it kind of reminds me of that exercise they made us do in letters where they took out 20% of the words and asked us to comprehend.
Right.
Even if you're getting that 80% goal, you're still not getting full comprehension.
Right. And then if you think too, I don't know if anybody has read the reading comprehension blueprint. I'm pretty sure it's chapter 4 that talks about vocabulary, and Nancy Hennessy cites that you have to have about 95% of the words in a passage that you're reading. You have to know the vocabulary around them to be able to comprehend the text. So that supports this idea of having to have a high level of accuracy. So let's talk about Scarborough's Rope. And my goal this year with my schools is I've printed and laminated copies of Scarborough's Rope because I want us pulling this out and talking about it and looking at it when we are reviewing our data, when we're thinking about our instructional practices, when we're thinking about supplementing curriculum or what our curriculum needs might be, right? I want us to be able to go back and lean into Scarborough's Rope for those discussions. But if we're going to do that, we have to be able to talk about it deeply, right? So what we can pull from the connection between the Simple View of Reading and Scarborough's Rope is we have the language comprehension pieces here and the word recognition pieces here. And we know that reading is not simple. Hollis Scarborough developed this, I think it was in 2001, and she was talking with early childhood educators and parents and helping them conceptualize what the skills are that go into word recognition and language comprehension. This is not an exhaustive list of all of the skills that go into language comprehension and word recognition, but it really helps us sort of anchor how we think about getting towards skilled reading. So again, let's do just quick thumbs up. Anybody not seen Scarborough's Rope? Thumbs up that you have, thumbs down that you haven't. Cool. So what are some big takeaways around Scarborough's Rope?
One of the big takeaways for me is that, a lot of people think like, the K2 is word recognition and the 3 through 5 is language comprehension. And while we know from letters, you do have that percentage shift. I found it interesting that you just said that she talked to early childhood educators, because I feel like kids are so much more successful when they come in with the top part really experience with their families or with their childcare centers. And then, that K2, yes, a little bit heavier, but they still need to be doing the top part of the rope in K2. And then same thing, like in 3 through 5, that yes, it shifts a little bit more to language comprehension, but that bottom part is still really important. And that's, a lot of teachers of older children are like, oh, that's just for the little kids. And while it's ideal that the younger grades, they have mastered it, it's still a necessary component to become a skilled reader. So just like paying attention to all of those pieces is really important.
So Kendra, I love that you shared that, because that's something that's really been on my mind a lot lately. Like, how do we pay attention to all of these pieces all the time? And my frame of thought has really been around thinking about upper elementary, middle school, and high school. Like, that language comprehension piece is how we learn, right? So when I started today and said, this is designed to be interactive and conversational, and please interrupt me, it's because this is how we learn together, right? So 7th grade science needs to participate in the language community, not just sit and read and then put on a worksheet or write about. Like, there has to be that oral language development that occurs always. Like, that's part of learning, right? So we might have strong language comprehension skills, but when I'm tackling difficult content, I'm 47 and I have been an educator for a long time, and I still need to be able to engage in oral discourse with my colleagues to help me deepen and understand and learn when there's a new component of the job that I'm doing or the work that we're doing together. And I think that sometimes that gets lost for older children, the need for participating in that language community.
Well, I also think it's, oh, sorry, Allison.
Oh, go Patty.
Okay. I also think it's important, especially in the classroom, and not thinking that these are skills to be taught differently at different times. That we need to be bringing all of these things in, no matter what subject we're talking about, and that it needs to be implemented together. And,
Yes.
It's not just a separate time for vocabulary or spelling or, stuff like that, but all of this needs to be actively working together and not set aside in certain chunks of our day.
Right. And I think that's sort of where we get a little bit mistaken, because as we're learning, right? As we learn, our knowledge is sort of surface level, right? And we'll talk about phonological awareness in just a little bit, but oh, I didn't know I was supposed to be teaching and growing and developing phonological awareness with my students. So now I'm going to do that. But maybe as a classroom teacher, I don't yet know how to integrate that with my phonics instruction. And those two things shouldn't necessarily always be separate. They should be integrated. And that applies also for our older students, right? If I'm learning a new vocabulary word like photosynthesis, I'm going to be able to better own that word if I can connect to the sounds and the patterns of that word. I can practice saying it orally. We can talk about the parts of the word and then move into a vocabulary lesson. I'm going to own it. I'm going to hold it deeper than if I try to just keep it isolated and by itself. And so I think that is an important component of this also. One of the things that I think is most important that our parents, our administrators, our classroom teachers, our district leaders, our board members, because it impacts everything. There needs to be deep understanding that this is something that we call biologically primary. And you all know this, our brains are wired for expressive and receptive language, right? So most children are going to start developing first that receptive language and then that expressive language in infancy and moving into toddlerhood, so that by the time, like Kendra mentioned earlier, by the time they get to school with us, whether it's preschool or it is kindergarten, there are some oral language skills that have already been developed. There's going to be variance in the children that come to us, but we have to develop that, continue to develop that oral language component, both expressively and receptively. And then word recognition is what we call biologically secondary. So our brains are not wired for print, right? We have to build those neurological superhighways between the different processors in the brain to help with that automatic recall of phonemes and graphemes and words for connected reading and for writing. So I promise I will do my best to keep up with the chat, but then also it'll distract me from sharing what I prepared for you. So I did ask ahead of time. Jen Lewis and Christina will be sort of helping me like manage and navigate the chat. So if they answer some of the questions or contribute there, just know that they're helping me, and I'm not intentionally neglecting anybody in the chat. Okay. So this 4-part processing model is the third of 4 sort of visual metaphors or anchors that we're going to look at together. The fourth one will come later, but this one was really powerful to me as a special education teacher, because I swear you can see processing deficits in students, right? Like if you're working with a student who has a significant processing deficit, it's almost like you can visibly see the student trying to work through that or stumbling through that. And I didn't necessarily understand what it was that I was witnessing until I got a better understanding around how the brain learns to read and how the brain acquires literacy skills. And this 4-part processing model was incredibly valuable to helping me sort of consider cognitive load, right? So when we think about cognitive load, we have our processors down here at the bottom. We have the orthographic processor, and that tells you that is the letter N. It's the part of your brain that has allowed you to see that symbol and then map or connect the name of that symbol to it. Right, Deborah, 1989. The first one was 86, 2001, 1989. And the cool thing about these two is, sometimes critics of the research will say that it's outdated. It's not outdated. This is when we first started to develop conceptual understanding. And then the fMRI studies and the research that's been done since then has validated sort of where we started before we had that, those fMRI studies. So our orthographic processor allows us to see the letter and know the name of our letter. And then the phonological processor allows me to process and understand that the letter N makes the N sound, isolate it and recognize it in words like no, nice, never, any of those types of words. When I give explicit and systematic phonics instruction, that is the connection here that I'm building that neurological highway for students, right? I'm building those connections and those pathways so that they're able to have that automatic recall. There's also the meaning processor and the context processor. So the meaning processor is almost like this mental file cabinet or Rolodex, so that if you see a word like this, you can immediately sort of go into that mental file cabinet and start associating meaning. And depending on each of you, some of you, when you saw that word, might have said, oh, I forgot to go for a run this morning. I promise I didn't have that thought. Patty, I see you shaking your head too. Some of you might think, I need to run to the store because I don't have anything for dinner. Or somebody might think, I wonder who's going to run that PowerPoint, right? Like different, like our frame right now is going to connect us to a different meaning of that word. But when I put it into a sentence, then your meaning, context, orthographic, and phonological processors all start working very rapidly together, almost instantaneously with very little cognitive energy, so that you can read and comprehend the sentence. So I'm going to write a sentence. And you probably have already finished reading it and could probably already predict how the sentence was going to end before I had even finished writing it. Am I accurate in that general assessment? Like you already knew, right? And that's because you were able to use all of your cognitive energy to not only decode, that took very little cognitive energy, but then use your context and meaning processors, go into that file cabinet and figure out that the meaning of the word run had to do with mascara coming down my face. So one of the cool ahas for me was thinking about how children acquire vocabulary through reading. If you have a student who is really struggling to decode text and they're trying to read this and it's going phoneme by phoneme and it's difficult for them to blend it across, then they are using all of their cognitive energy down here. And there's almost nothing left to be able to then understand the context and the meaning of what they're reading. However, when there's no cognitive energy, like the cognitive load is very low and reading becomes automatic, then students can start to engage in thinking about what they're reading. So, kindergartner or a first grader is no, Patty, it's not waterproof. There's the problem. A kindergarten or a first grader may understand the context of the word run, like the thing they do with their body at recess when they move really fast. But because they can decode that, or if they can decode that, when they run into that word, see what I did there? When they run into that word in a different context, then they're going to be able to use the context of the sentence to help them determine the meaning. Make sense? And now we're growing vocabulary and starting to understand multiple meaning words. Questions about that 4-part processing model? Okay. So then let's talk about data. And it's important we talk about these anchors first, because when we assess and when we try to be diagnostic in our assessment, we have to be able to lean into thinking about cognitive load, thinking about the Scarborough's rope and the interdependence of those different domains when it comes to reading comprehension. So some of the work that I did with one of my schools last year was really thinking about data culture. And when we started having these conversations with data, I'm sure you all have experienced this. The conversation very quickly shifts to that child is a second language learner. That child has an IEP. That child is never at school. Those parents fill in the blank, like whatever it might be. And that can quickly derail a data conversation. And in the conversations that I had last year with teachers, this became a really sort of tough, like, hurdle to jump over, because so many of the teachers were working really hard and feeling very frustrated that they weren't seeing the gains in their students, despite working very hard. And so I think it's natural for us to then look for other reasons that we're not seeing those gains, right? However, what happens when we start filling in the space with that child or those parents or whatever is we shift the conversation away from what am I supposed to do next? Because the truth is, it doesn't really matter, right? If the child has an IEP, that's okay. We still have an obligation to serve them and to grow them. And research tells us 95% of kids can learn to read. And that's not what our data is showing us, right? So it is imperative that when we lead these conversations in our schools, or we participate in these conversations of our schools, that we are able to shift the conversation back to what does the data say? The data is not here to lay blame on you or the teachers or the administrators or the children or the parents. The data just gives us the story of what needs to happen next. How many of you feel like this is an obstacle in data conversations? Several of you. And I will be totally honest, it resulted in tears. Like, in having these hard conversations, it resulted in tears around, like, if it's not the kids, like, these are the words of one teacher, if it's not the children, and I can't say that it's because they're never here, then there's only one person left to blame, and it's me. And I push back on that because that's absolutely not true. We are in a space where we are shifting and trying to adapt our practices to fit what the science tells us. It's not my fault that I wasn't taught the science of how the brain learns to read in the expensive grad program that I finished, which was focused totally on elementary reading, right? Like, that's not my fault. That's a systemic structural problem that's being addressed now in 2023. So it's important that we help teachers also understand that it's not their fault. Just like we're not going to blame the kids, we're not going to blame the teachers, but when we know better, we have to do better. And I had such a wonderful conversation with Christina yesterday, and we were talking about decodable books and leveled books, and she used the word, she said she was happy to learn that she was wrong, or something along those lines. And I said, you're not wrong. Like, it's not about being right or wrong. It's about learning and moving and growing, right? And so we don't get to blame ourselves for information that we didn't have, but when we have it, we have to do better, right? Okay, so let's keep talking about data. This is a graphic that I sort of recreated and hijacked from the OFCC, which is observation and feedback coaching cycle trainings that we've done. And I've shared this with my schools because I think it really helps us understand that in order to have a data-driven culture, there has to be a cyclical approach to assessment, analysis, and action. So we're going to complete an assessment here. Most of us our schools are in the middle of working on those assessments. And then we have to collectively look at that data together. And then that data has to inform our instruction and our next steps. So often what happens is there's an assessment, and then the teachers go forth and teach. And then we come back together in January and we're like, oh, why aren't we making gains? Well, was there an analysis discussion? Was there a discussion about next steps? And we can't make assumptions that everybody understands the data the same way. And so we need to work in collaboration with each other to ensure that we are learning from each other and analyzing data together and supporting. There's new teachers in every school building. They are not going to know how to analyze that data. And even if you do, it doesn't mean that you know the next action step. So we have to stay in collaboration there when we think about having this cyclical process. So my data is going to tell me what we need, and we're going to analyze it. It's going to tell me what our action steps are. Our action steps should include some sort of progress monitoring so that we're able to see that the thing we're doing is working. And then we assess again and we come back around and we do this on a regular and consistent basis. And this only happens if it's prioritized in the school community, which means school leaders have to make time and space for teachers, coaches, and administrators to participate in these collaborative discussions. So I want to open this up and have a conversation as we think about having a data-driven culture and using data to make decisions. Who does the data belong to? I think this is a big barrier in a lot of schools. Who should the data belong to?
The students, right? It's about the students.
1,000,000% it's with the student, should belong to the students, right? How many of you are currently in schools where the data follows the children? Nice, Susan. I think Susan might be the exception. I'm in a school that's trying to create that system so that the data.
I'm going to say the same, Allison. I'm in a school that's a goal.
Yes, but that's not been our normal practice, right? And when we think about, so I taught 4th grade special education mostly, and then mostly upper elementary, but the number of times that we would have a 4th grader who had been at the school forever, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, it's a 3-alarm fire because this kiddo is struggling. That's a systemic failure. That child didn't all of a sudden lose all their literacy skills. That's a child who was struggling all along, and we didn't have a good assessment protocol, and we didn't have good data sharing protocols to catch that child before it became so obviously apparent in 4th grade. And so we have to ensure, data folders, but we had data folders, Christina, and there wasn't alignment of what that looked like because we didn't understand the assessment protocol. So data folders outside of strong assessment protocols that are vertically aligned are not going to serve children the way they should. And it requires strong systems so that if I have a data folder for my students, as a kindergarten teacher and Christina's the 1st grade teacher, then I'm going to hand that information up. And there's a system or a structure that allows for that data to follow the child from kinder, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. There should be no surprises by the time the child's in 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade. Yes.
Allison, this just made me think of how often when we collect the data, I taught kinder for years and years and would give a data folder every year to the 1st grade teachers. And I can't tell you how many times the 1st grade teacher said, you know what, I don't really look at this. I want to determine where this kid is on my own. I don't want to be influenced. And so I think that's something really important for us collectively is to get over that. We need to be influenced by the data. It needs to guide our instruction.
1,000,000%. And I will share with you all, years ago, I don't think it's the practice. I mean, I know it's not the practice anymore, but in Rio Rancho public schools, we were required to do baseline testing on all of our students before they started school. So Meet the Teacher included doing a DRA level in addition to, Roma's nodding like, yes, I remember, in addition to collecting other pieces of data, which it sounds nice, right? Oh, day one, I get to start with instruction based on what my kids need. However, I worked with children who all had some sort of special education eligibility. Most of them had dyslexia, even though we weren't even calling it dyslexia yet. And so I remember one child in particular, and it was my first year as a classroom teacher. a special education teacher, and I had reviewed his IEP, but I was required to benchmark at grade level. And he came in and I was supposed to give him a DRA 40. Now, we already know, like, we're not even going to discuss using leveled text to assess children. We all know that's no longer a good practice, but I was still required to give him the DRA 40. And he walks in with his mom, and his mom says, he's really low. And I just was like, it broke my heart because she said that in front of him, and what a hard thing for him to hear. And he already knows reading is hard. And I was like, that's all right. We're going to have a great time together. And mom left and we sat down and I put that 40 in front of him and he looked at it and he looked at me and he said, I can't read that. And that made me feel like a horrible human because here I am. It's like, nice to meet you. Let me ask you to do the impossible. So the instructions I was given, and I didn't know any better, was just to go down to the next level, down to the next level until you find where they are. So I pulled out the 38 and he looks at it and he looks at me with tears welling up in his eyes. And he said, I can't read that. I was like, no problem, buddy. I put it away. And because I like to follow rules that make sense, but that one didn't make sense to me. So instead of grabbing the 36, I went for the 20 and I pulled that out and he started to read it. And his voice was quivering and I just took over and we started reading it together. I had never met a child who worked so hard, but I forgot why I brought this story up. Oh, you guys, I totally lost track and went on a tangent. What were we talking about right before that? Julie.
Looking at data and then not looking at data because you want to form your own opinion, but then how to use that data.
So like I had some data that he was reading at a 40. I used that to help myself, but it didn't really serve me in that purpose, right? Like I had his IEP, but in general, we didn't have that across the board outside of special education. So I think we need to have hard, concrete data that drives our instruction. And we also need to be forming our own opinions. I think both of those things are true, right? Like one doesn't have to extinguish the other. Let's talk about the second piece. What's the purpose of the data?
To drive instruction.
Should be, right? Should be. But that
needs.
Say that again.
To support the child's needs.
Absolutely, right? Like we should be able to say, this is what Jamie needs to move forward in second grade. Data should, in my mind, data collection should be like a transactional exchange, right? So if I go out to dinner and I spend a lot of money in a restaurant and the meal was really poor or the service was really poor, I kind of feel like I wasted my money. Like if I'm going to go out and spend good money on a nice meal, I want it to be like enjoyable and delicious and nice service. And I think we need to think about data in the same way. If I am going to spend time assessing students, then it should be for the purpose of informing my instruction. Anytime I pull students from instruction to complete an assessment, I'm taking away from instructional time. So I have to make sure that I'm using that data very well and that I am mindful of the time I'm taking from instruction. It used to drive me crazy because I received students who newly qualified for special education, and there would be all of this data that had to be reported in order for them to even become eligible to be tested for special education. And then when I received the student, I had no data. And so I had to start over from assessment because that communication pipeline was broken. And so if we have a mindset of the data belongs to the students and it's not just in our grade to grade progression, but it's part of our systems, then we get more instructional time back for our students. Yes, Marla. We're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again because we're not paying attention and sharing information of what was done last year and so forth. And then let's talk about triangulation of data. Like, what do we really mean by that? And is it something that we feel is utilized well? Susan saying no.
I think this is really interesting because like going back to the purpose of data, it's like we have to, as educators, quantify a student's ability to show mastery of a skill, right? Like, what are they saying? What are they doing? And then I give that a number or a percentage or a letter or something. And then we've got different forms of data and assessment that all quantify it very differently, right? Like we're looking at iStation, I'm looking at a reading screener that's giving me a level, and then I'm looking at this. So I think sometimes we need to do that, right? But that quantification piece of it is really tricky. But and then that also goes back to student ownership, right? If I'm owning my learning, I need to know what my path is. Like if I'm going from a 1 to a 2, what do I need to be able to do, show my teacher that I can move to that next step? So it's what does success look like for kids? And then how does that tie back to quantifying the learning in different assessments? Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. Understanding that a single assessment, it's not just a single assessment, but it's a single assessment in the way that it's given is not going to give you the same results for every student. And different assessments serve different purposes. When we think about education systems as a whole, right, in order to justify continuing to provide educators in the state of New Mexico with science of reading training and support, there has to be data that tells the state government that this is money well spent, right? So the state needs data, and the state has chosen to use iStation to collect that data. And that data can inform my instructional practices, but it's only a single data point. So it might not be the only thing that informs my instructional practices. And then how we report on that data within to parents and to within our class, like within our like grade level teams and school ecosystems and districts and communities. One of the administrators I worked for when I was still in APS told me that our school did really, really well because kids grew on iStation, and they grew by like 7%, but they started so far behind. And so the conversation, like my question, and Jen will probably laugh because I say this all the time, kids are going to grow in spite of us. Kids are going to grow because they breathe. They're going to grow because they're developing, right? And so we have to be able to think about data as individual students, but also as systems, so that we can understand how our practices are informing their growth and their development, right? We don't get to just say, oh yeah, kids grew, and then think that that's enough. It's not. It has to be growth in spite of us. I'm sorry, they will grow in spite of us. It has to be growth because of us, because of the things that we're doing in our classrooms and systemically. So this is data that I put together for one of my schools, and it's BOY and EOY iStation data, and it's the same sort of cohort of children. So this is starting at the beginning of the year kindergarten and end of the year kindergarten, and then beginning of the year first grade and end of the year first grade, and then beginning of the year second grade and end of the year second grade. And then level 1 iStation through level 5 iStation. I know the colors don't match, but we know that level 1 is our students in need of most support, and level 5 is our students in need who are meeting the goal of where we would like them to be, and they're ready to learn reading skills the way they need to. So what was really interesting is I put this together and I shared it with the administrators who had never looked at the data this way, and the teachers had never looked at the data this way. And this is one of the benefits of having something like iStation, where you can look at historical data and it's collected in one place. So thoughts on what you see here?
It's going back to looking at past data. I think I've had this conversation possibly with you, but I know a couple of other people, but like when people talk about COVID and, oh, it was, the time, and that's why my students are behind or whatever, you can actually go back and pull data pre-COVID and show that this was an issue back 5 years ago. And
well, NAEP data is really good at showing that.
Or just even looking at data previous to last school year. I think that even looking back at trends within your school is valuable to look at, and not just right there in the moment. Yes, that's valuable information, but also looking back at, the information that you have beforehand,
right,
as well.
I would agree, Patty. So what I found really interesting, go ahead, Patricia.
I just keep thinking back to that teacher, and I was one of them at one time. Well, that's not valid data. That's not really testing them on what they're on. And how do you deal with them? How do you show them, yeah, it really is. I mean, it may not be your favorite, but it really is valid to what we're trying to do with our students.
Well, and that, being totally honest, when I shared that, that was some of what I got from the teachers. Well, it's not the same students come and go. Like that's sort of an irrelevant thing to add here, because it really does show us the instructional practices, right? Like, and this is not, and what I said was, this is not about you as teachers. This is about a system, right? Because there's multiple grades, there's multiple teachers at each grade level, and then we can see that over time the disparity gets bigger, it doesn't get smaller. So this is a systems issue. This isn't nobody's pointing fingers at the teacher issue. But if we're not looking at this data side by side like this, we're not seeing if we're closing gaps or growing gaps. And in this school, in this case, we are growing the gaps, which is problematic. Go ahead, Susan.
I keep thinking back to that triangulation of data too. Like it comes from this, and we want to grow our students, obviously, and we want to see that growth. And one of the things that I am noticing more and more all the time is language alignment. And it is a hill that I'm going to die on, because if we have two forms of assessment that speak the same language, that are assessing the same thing, and then we have a third form of assessment that speaks a different language, but is assessing the same thing, and our students are struggling, there's a reason for that. That gives us information as far as what is actually being assessed and how we can better understand that data, because our students, especially our English language learners or our SLDs, they need that consistent language, especially in areas that they're already struggling in.
So I'm just going to piggyback on that, because I think this is a hill I'm willing to die on this year too. And I've really spoken pretty openly about it with my schools. It's not, that doesn't exist just in assessment, that exists in our instruction and our tiers of instruction as well. So if you're in tier 1 talking about Magic E, and in tier 2 it's the same idea, but you're saying sneaky E, and then tier 3 we're calling it vowel consonant E, we're taking our most struggling learners and we're using different language, that can be problematic. And like children need to have some flexibility here, right? But it's our job to scaffold that so that they understand that when I say Magic E, vowel consonant E, and sneaky E, I am talking about the vowel consonant E syllable type all day, every day, right? But those are things that in our buildings, we don't even have awareness of. We don't even know what that alignment should look like or sound like. And so that is a big, that's a big rock for one of my schools this year, is creating that alignment. Yes, Deborah, New Mexico is the only state that says layers. Every other state, it's MTSS. New Mexico is the only state that says MLSS. So you will have to just forgive me on having that exchange of language. So Stephanie Stoller, if you're not familiar with who she has a really great resource. It's called the Reading Science Academy. She's super knowledgeable. She will say tears also because she is not out of New Mexico. But computer-based assessments have value, but we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. So a computer adapted test can produce a false negative and a false positive. We know that. It may or may not provide the accommodations that children need. It may or may not accurately show where strengths or deficits are in early reading, depending on what's being used. We've talked about that. We've talked about thank you, Jen, for sharing that, the fine motor skills that are required for using in the early grades, some of those computer-based assessments. And there is zero substitute for listening to your students read, like zero substitute for listening to your students read. And so while iStation is what the state requires, and while it serves a purpose, it may not be enough. We may need to consider listening to our students read and doing something like an oral reading fluency. And what I find really interesting is I remember I was teaching 3rd grade and I had just felt like I'd really learned dibbles. And then I get to school, like the first day of teachers coming back, and it's like, we're not doing dibbles, we're doing iStation. And I was like, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? And I remember Jen smiling because we were teaching 3rd grade together at the same time. And we're like, kind of freaking out. I feel like, and you guys can tell me if this has been your perspective, if you have sort of noticed this also, but we switched to iStation and we threw the baby out with the bathwater because we stopped doing an oral reading fluency measure because that was associated with dibbles. And when I spoke to some of my teachers last year about doing an oral reading fluency and how you can access those resources for free from Dibbles or Acadience or other organizations, they were like, we're allowed to do that? And I was like, I mean, like, yes, you should listen to your students read. So I'm just curious if you all have seen that same sort of thing where like we were told we had to do iStation, and that is what the state is requiring. But in buildings and in districts, we should have the latitude to decide if we need something more or in addition to that iStation data point. Anybody currently doing oral reading fluency? So Ada, I know iStation has an ORF column, but I'm not aware that it has an opportunity. Like my understanding is teachers can input that data, but it's not its own assessment. Am I incorrect?
Yeah, it's its own assessment. They call it like the recording studio or something, and kids are given, they have to have the headphones with the mic, right? Or mic access on their Chromebook, but it records them reading a passage, and then the teacher can go in and listen and score it from what the student has read. And then MAPS has the same sort of system where they read it. I think Reading A to Z also has one that they can, it's just a recording, I guess, app or software, and then teachers go back and they can code it after the student's done. But still, again, going back to what you said, it's not you physically there watching, observing, seeing what the kid's doing while they're reading. It's just an app or a software.
Well, and from the child's perspective, they're not reading to their teacher, they're reading to a computer. So that the impact that has on the child's performance, I think, is something that does not, I don't think it's been researched. I know that it's not been researched as to the validity or the reliability of a computer-based test versus a individual and how students are performing. And I don't know that it's national. Is it nationally normed?
It is. I know MAPS is. I don't know about iStations, because it's not producing a score. It's just like a tool for you to use, right? So it's not saying this kid got 80% accuracy on this ORF. It's it's you going in and writing notes and all that into it. But I also agree, like, we had first graders, and depending on their confidence level, like I had this first grader, Sassy Pants. She was reading it with like prosody and like giving me character. And then I had another baby just listening and just struggling through it. And so it's like, how useful is a tool like that with kiddos who might not, that would be struggling through it.
Well, and I think there's the part of it too that are struggling readers. Like if you're just working one-on-one with me and you are just reading an oral reading fluency only has to be 1 minute read. And so if it's like I had my students who were struggling readers would read to me for 1 minute. And when I said to them, you only have to read for 1 minute, it's like this weight was lifted, right? And so I don't know if that's part of the iStation or the NWEA maps, but it's certainly worth sort of investigating and checking out. Like really the purpose is about how we think about collecting different sources of data and then utilizing that to move students forward and create a data-driven culture. I think that what is most important is that we have alignment, right? So if I am using Acadience for an oral reading fluency in 2nd grade, then that needs to be aligned across the school building. If I use Acadience and somebody else is using NWEA and somebody else is using DIBELS, then we're not really making apples to apples comparisons to be able to see growth over time when thinking about systems. Go ahead, Jen.
Pat had a really good question about the ORF having to get a certain cutoff score. It's my understanding that the teachers actually, it doesn't automatically give them that test, that the teacher has to enable it. And I don't know if anyone has more knowledge on that, but I do not believe that students just automatically get that assessment.
But I don't know, Ada, do you know if that is something that has to be?
There's a button at the bottom that the kids can click on.
Yeah,
it's an icon.
It's different from the fluency component to ISIP. It's like just an extra oral reading fluency.
Cool. Okay. So let's talk about a possible assessment flowchart. So iStation and an oral reading fluency, whether you're doing it in iStation maps or something different, can serve as a universal screener. iStation can serve as a diagnostic to some degree. That's part of why I think the state went with it, is because it has some diagnostic capacities. But what I have seen with iStation is as students move forward in the grades and the expectation of maybe what they can do and what's expected, there seems to be a little bit more of a shallow data set for some students. So we have to have a good understanding of this if our students are showing that they are at risk, because that's going to drive whether or not we need to give a different diagnostic assessment. Patty, I'll put it in our shared drive. So diagnostic assessments include things like the PAST assessment from Dr. David Kilpatrick, doing a letters, phonics, or spelling screener. It allows us to drill down more specifically what those holes and gaps are. Oral reading fluency is just a screener, and we'll talk more about the oral reading fluency in just a minute, but it is a good indicator that there might be something else that we want to investigate more. Depending on the data you pull from iStation, like for kindergarten, it's going to be pretty closely correlated to what it is that you're needing to teach and what's expected. But by the time children get older, there's going to be a little bit more of a discrepancy here. And then you give your diagnostic, you provide instruction on those specific skill gaps, you progress monitor that, and then you come back around and do it again. So those universal screeners should be done, we know this, 3 times per year. If we're deciding as a organization, if a school is deciding they're going to do an oral reading fluency, it would also be done 3 times a year. And then the diagnostics are based on how the students perform from there. So fluency is defined as reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression that leads to accurate and deep comprehension and a motivation to read. So often we tend to think about fluency, or I don't think we think about fluency this way. I think it's how it gets translated to children, and it's that they have to read fast. So fast is not the objective. Accurate and with a reasonable pace and expression to support comprehension. Because remember, thinking of the simple view of reading, comprehension is the end goal. And fluency is complex. There is a lot that goes into fluency. And so as we think about fluency, it's important that we realize that an oral reading fluency is not designed or intended to measure all of the things regarding fluency. It is just that temperature check that tells us, do my students have the skills necessary to be able to comprehend text? Like, just like a universal screener is designed to do, it is a temperature check. And there is no substitute for listening to children read. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just thinking of the school that I'm at. They do have a fluency program online, and this is exactly what I observed in the classroom, is that when they are on their own and they're assigned to take their fluency screener on the computer, they'll just sit there and they'll read as fast as they can and trying to get to the end, because that's their end goal. And if they're doing that on their own, and again, not being slowed down and being reminded, hey, this is not how fast you can read, that they're just going to go off and do their own thing. And again, I don't know how, I wouldn't think it would be very reliable information if I was a teacher looking back on it later on during the day to see where they are, because their intentions are not in the right place, I guess. Like, I just think of when you start your lesson or when you start an assessment, laying out that foundation of what your expectations are and how to do it correctly. Right. And in order to have that reliable information, instead of being like, okay, take your iStation, benchmark, or, it's time to progress monitor, take out your computer, and not really laying that foundation of why they're doing it and what this information is going to be using, and not really taking ownership of that. It's just something they have to do.
Right. I think it's important too that we keep in mind the differences between using oral reading fluency, a nationally normed measure of oral reading fluency, as a universal screener, like you would check like if I have a fever, it tells you that my body is fighting something, but it doesn't tell you what or why, right? So, and that is separate and different from fluency instruction. But we won't know why we have a fever if we don't do the diagnostics after the oral reading fluency for students who need it. And if we do the diagnostics, most of the time, children who are below the 35th percentile, it is because there is something else going on that has to do with the word recognition strands. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. I have a couple of articles that I'll pop into the chat. Actually, Jen, would you mind pulling those articles? They're in the slide deck that I shared with you, and popping those into the chat. And then we also will talk about like who we would do it, when we would do it, and what are some valid resources in just a minute. Go ahead, Susan.
I was just thinking back to the taking of the temperature of it. And I have a grade level this year that does not want to influence or bias their students in any way before taking their BOY for iStations, because they want a true read of where the students are. They're not giving them any information as far as, especially like the ownership piece. And I really want them to be able to understand and communicate to those students what the purpose is. I mean, why are we doing this iStations? We have to do it every month, and you know, we do it at the beginning of the year and what have you. Sure, we want a true read of where the students are, but shouldn't we give them the opportunity to at least know how to take that assessment?
It goes back
so
to
that,
the question of what are we actually measuring?
right.
So I'm not going to influence an assessment by telling children how to respond, but am I going to set them up for success by helping them understand the purpose and why I want them to feel motivated and excited around it? 1,000,000%, yes.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I'm really struggling with that. And I'm trying to figure out how to best communicate the need for that, because yeah.
Yeah, I think
Susan,
that
have they taken their BOY yet, or you just mean in general iStation?
I don't know that if they've taken their BOY yet or not. I was at my school and we were having this conversation, and I had said something about, you know, letting the students are going through the process of how to take the iStations assessment. And that was the comment. Well, we want to get a true read of where they really are right now. Okay. Are we testing their test taking abilities, or are we seeing where they are in their reading skills currently?
Right. I think this is the kind of thing that could, I've had a lot of conversations about this too, right? Like thinking about the testing environment and the teachers buy-in, and children are not naturally extrinsically motivated. Not all of them. I mean, intrinsically motivated, right? Some of them we have to build that extrinsic motivator for them and describe it and explain it, because just like we don't want to give students an unfair advantage by trying to like teach to the test, we also know that just clicking through something is also not a measure of what they can do. So I feel like that could be a whole nother PD session, is building that testing space and how we support students with that. I'm going to have you guys read this for just a second, which I found to be quite interesting. And then I'm going to quote my friend, Rebecca, who says, data or it didn't happen. And this is one of the reasons that is so important, because like our biases come into play all the time, whether we like it or not. That kiddo who tries really hard and we see it and we feel it, like we might overestimate their abilities when it comes to oral reading fluency because they're so dear to us and we know they work so hard. And so this is an important thing for us to keep in mind, is that we tend to be overly generous. And so unless you can plot that data or it didn't happen, then we're not really being objective, and we're not really leaning into that data-driven instruction and data-driven culture. We are allowing what we feel about a student to drive instruction instead of what the data tells us. I think this was on a previous slide, but I don't think I specifically mentioned it. Oral reading fluency has a 0.91 correlation to comprehension. And that is for me, that was such a powerful thing to learn, because in a 1-minute read around oral reading fluency, if my student is at risk, then based on their accuracy and their rate, then I know that comprehension is going to be impacted. And so if I know that comprehension is going to be impacted, then I can do something else more diagnostic to help close that gap. But if we're thinking back to that triangulation of data, then if my iStation looks good, if my oral reading fluency looks good, then those two pieces and my classwork is matching it, then I can feel pretty confident that my student has the skills that they need. But I did have a teacher do this last year, and she had 21 students in her first grade classroom. 3 had been green on iStation, and in like March, she did an oral reading fluency, and she found 3 of the 21 who were green on iStation had significant delays in their oral reading fluency. And that allowed her to be very specific and find out exactly why, and then provide that instruction. So I think it's really important. The Reading League recommends 1st through 5th graders, all students should have an oral reading fluency done by a teacher so that you can listen to your students read. It's done one-on-one. It's 1 minute, and it's a 1-minute read. If you're using Acadience, so there's a lot of there's a few free nationally normed resources that are solid resources. I saw Pat shared Dibbles earlier. Acadience also has free resources. And so Acadience is the original Dibbles. Dibbles from the University of Oregon is new Dibbles. So the original authors of Dibbles sold it to University of Oregon, and then they created Acadience, but they had to change the name because there was like Dibbles 8 and Dibbles Next and all of this stuff that was confusing. So University of Oregon said, you can't call that Dibbles because we're using Dibbles. So now it's Acadience. So through the Acadience website, you can also get the free PDF forms for doing an oral reading fluency. They have all of the different assessment pieces, but the oral reading fluency, they have a benchmark, beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. Both Acadience and Dibbles have that. And then they have progress monitoring passages. So you would benchmark the student based on the grade they're supposed to be in to identify their level of proficiency or if they're at risk. And then you would progress monitor based on their skill level. And then the Reading League recommends 6th grade and beyond. If students are showing you that they're at risk, then you need to do an oral reading fluency measure. Most students, if they are below the 35th percentile, are at risk of not recovering, and they are at risk of having that gap grow instead of closing it. So that's part of the reason that you want to use that oral reading fluency, is because if you can identify who's at risk, then you can be very diagnostic. So it's a 1-minute read. You want to consider both words correct per minute and accuracy scores. Jen shared the Acadience site. I know Pat shared the University of Oregon site. Acadience, both of them have complete directions. They have norming charts. They have everything you would need to do that oral reading fluency. Acadience directions are a little bit different. You'll see when you look at Acadience, they have 3 passages for beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year benchmark. The reason for that is because when children tend to know something, they tend to be more fluent in their reading about that, even if they're a poor reader. So children in Albuquerque who see hot air balloons all the time are going to be more fluent when reading a passage about hot air balloons because they have the background knowledge and the vocabulary. Children who have never seen a hot air balloon before in their life are going to struggle more with fluency of a passage if it includes information about hot air balloons. So Acadience has 3 passages because you would give students passages on 3 separate topics, and then you take the median score to be your true fluency measure. Acadience and Dibbles do that differently. You can download and print all of the assessment materials from each of those for free. If your school uses MClass, they are using University of Oregon Dibbles assessment tools, and MClass collects the data. Acadience you can download for free. The paid Acadience is the data management piece of it. I can show you where to find those free resources later. So you're going to benchmark 3 times a year. It's free. It's nationally normed. If you are not sure, or if you have teachers in your school who are not sure how to give an oral reading fluency assessment, There are instructions for both of those on exactly how to do it, but I am sure your structured literacy coach or a structured literacy coach would be happy to help with that. They all have their own sort of benchmarking goals of what you're looking at. And it's, again, based on national norms. And this is an important thing to consider because we don't want to think about like the 35th percentile in my classroom, and that little ecosystem is going to be different than might be different than the school. It might be different than the state. And we want our students to be able to perform and to be sure that we're providing them the instruction to be able to read comparative to students across the country. So we talked a lot about oral reading fluency and why it is so important. But then if your students are behind on the oral reading fluency, and they're showing that they're at risk, then you need to do something diagnostic. And so the PAST test, and I know many schools are using different types of, I'm putting this in the chat, different types of phonological awareness screeners. And I know many schools are using Heggerty, and Heggerty has its own phonological awareness screener, but or assessment, but the PAST test is the only one that I know of that measures for automaticity. And so it is so important that we think about automaticity when looking at phonological awareness skills. So automaticity, proficiency in phonological awareness tasks is defined as automaticity. And Dr. Kilpatrick shares with us that a 2-second response is what's considered automatic. I think Heggerty says 3 seconds or 4 seconds. If we're not measuring for automaticity, then we don't really know if we're moving towards proficiency. And phoneme proficiency at the phoneme level is what gives us the most bang for our buck when you are thinking about reading and spelling skills. And it is super easy to administer. It's done one-on-one with students. The entire assessment, as well as the instructions for the assessment, are available for free at thepasttest.com. And so I would highly encourage you, if you've not given the PAST assessment, reach out to your structured literacy coach, or read through the instructions, or both. This assessment scores, students get points, so to speak, if they are correct and if they're automatic. And so what this helps you understand is where to begin instruction so that you're moving to that phoneme level as quickly as possible based on their conceptual understanding of the skills. If nothing is correct, then they don't have a conceptual understanding of deleting syllables. So if you give that test, you can see where you begin developing that conceptual understanding, or maybe where you're just practicing to develop automaticity. Yes, Marla, we're going to go back and look at that sort of flow chart again at the end, and then it'll hopefully wrap it back together. So all students who are considered at risk should get the diagnostic assessment. So if your student is below the 35th percentile on an oral reading fluency, it is wise to consider doing the PAST assessment. And then in the PAST assessment, the other thing that's important to consider is not every student needs the entire assessment. So in the instructions, and I shared this with structured literacy coaches last year, I'm happy to send it out again. In the assessment, there are some routing procedures. So if you have a 4th grader who is showing that they're at risk on their oral reading fluency, you don't have to start at the beginning of the assessment and do every test item. So that allows it to go a little bit quicker. And then talking about phonics and spelling surveys. So in my opinion, for whatever that's worth, we are a letters state. And so I think it makes most sense that we're using the letters phonics survey and spelling surveys, because then we create vertical alignment. And then we know our teachers will all get access to that training so that they know how to do it, and we're sort of speaking the same language. The phonics survey is going to tell you exactly what holes and gaps are missing for students. So remember, we're talking diagnostic assessments here, right? So my iStation data showed me my student is at risk, and or my oral reading fluency showed me my student was at risk. So I need to be diagnostic. I thought about doing a PAST. I'm doing a phonics survey. And then I might also consider doing a spelling survey. The thing to know about the phonics and the spelling surveys is there is no like gold standard of this is the scope and sequence that must be followed so that students learn to read. There is no research that says that the Spire scope and sequence versus the Foundation scope and sequence versus Recipe for Reading versus CKLA, that there is one that is better than the other. So when you're considering giving a screener, one of the things I've seen teachers get sort of tripped up about is like trying to make the grade level correlation. And there's not necessarily a consistent grade level correlation. It is about missing skill gaps. So if I see students are missing some long vowels and some digraphs and understanding of syllable types, I'm going in and I'm plugging those holes and gaps. The phonics survey is going to be thinking about the recognition piece. And then the spelling screener is going to be thinking about the spelling piece. So we need to be sure that we understand the intersection of reading and spelling. So children, we won't have time to go through the whole thing, but you can look up the Language Literacy Network from Jan Wasowitz. What I really, really appreciate about this graphic is it shows us the intersection of reading and spelling, or reading and writing. And we know that children who can spell are better decoders, and children who can write about what they've read have deeper reading comprehension. And so when we look at the Language Literacy Network, we see writing over here, and we see reading over here, and you can see it converge to show that intersection of skills. We meet children who can read but not spell, but we don't necessarily very often meet children who can spell but not read. And so we have to understand that these can't live in silos. Our spelling and our writing should work in conjunction and be connected to our phonics instruction and our literacy curriculum. They shouldn't be separate from each other. And when we spend time practicing handwriting, practicing spelling, we are improving reading skills as well. They're all part of those literacy skills. And your spelling screener could be given whole group, whereas the phonics screener would be given one-on-one. And those are all available for the structured literacy coaches. If you've not taken letters yet, all of the templates for those screeners are in the shared drive, and they can be shared with your teachers as well if they're not sure where to access them in letters. So coming back to that assessment flow chart, we looked at this sort of when we started talking, and now we're looking at it again, remembering that like our universal screeners are iStation and ORF. And then depending on your students, right? There's so much professional judgment here because there's a lot of complexity in the skills that go into reading. You might have enough data from iStation to inform your next steps instructionally, but you might need more diagnostic data. And that should be part of that cycle of assessment, analysis, and action. And then our progress monitoring is us keeping that temperature check as I'm going through. If I'm teaching short vowels, because that's what my data tells me my students need, I need some sort of progress monitoring tool to tell me that at the end of that instructional week, or 2 weeks or 3 days or whatever it is, that my students learned the thing that I intended for them to learn, which could possibly be a spelling test. And that is a conversation for another day. I know we have like 4 minutes left, so I apologize, but big questions, thoughts, ideas.
Allison, we did have someone ask if you would share the presentation or if that was going to be available.
Yes. So I will put a link to the presentation in the PD calendar invite that is on our website. And then for the structured literacy coaches, I will put it in our shared drive. Thanks, Jen. Thank you, guys. We are free to go. That is the end. Coaches, I'll see you in 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, Michelle. Miss you.
I miss you too. I was just texting with a couple people. I'm like, it's like the old days. So awesome.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi. So anyway, it was good. You did
I
good.
should
I learned
stop
a lot.
recording.
Bye.
Bye.